Yeah, it's responding to treatment, finally.
Good.
Sporadic remission of your Peyronie's?
Yeah, it's gone into a remission.
It has a waxing and waning.
Yeah.
Oh, guys, I can't come out today. I got a Peyronie's flare.
Flare.
Peyronie Slayer. Boys, have you been as terrified by this UFO news as I have been in the last week?
Well, in some way, yes, I'm scared, but in some ways, I think it explains a lot of my experiences, especially anally. So, I'm getting sort of a sense of closure.
Finally. Were you abducted?
Well, not so much. Probed.
Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Today's topic, we're continuing on with our anemia episodes. So last time we covered microcytic anemia. Today we will be covering normocytic anemia and hopefully a bit of that macrocytic anemia as well, time dependent. So as we started in our last pod, it's very kind of important to remember the physiology here in terms of our causes of anemia. So anytime that there's low hemoglobin, the kidneys are going to sense this with decreased oxygen delivery, and they will release erythropoietin, which will stimulate bones to produce our red blood cells. And there could be a couple sources along this path, or a couple disruptions along this path that can result in an anemia. And it's just important to remember this pathway with normocytic anemia, especially because there are so many causes. If we have a patient, we run the CBC on them, we see a normal MCV kind of between 80 and 100. What are we thinking next? How are we gonna go along this big differential and figure out what's going on?
Yeah. So, in terms of like a normocytic anemia, I guess the ways, and like this is kind of my approach to all types of anemia as well, is you either have an issue with production or kind of destruction. And so in that kind of framework...
What about sequestration? I'm sorry to interject.
Yeah, you could do that. Sure.
I just, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when people neglect sequestration. But anyway, proceed, please.
I mean, I think of that more in terms of like thrombocytopenia, but sure, you can also think of it in terms of anemia. And so in terms of that, you're kind of looking for, is there decreased production? So in that sense, you could have like anemia of chronic disease, such as a cancer. Or you could have a like increased destruction, in which case we're talking more about hemolysis, and we'll jump into, I guess, all of the different types of hemolysis because there's a bunch. And then the other one that I guess doesn't really fit too well into the framework, but just people who are hemorrhaging would also have a normocytic anemia. Like if they're just bleeding out in front of you, they would have a normocytic anemia. But that one's going to be, pretty obvious. If you see somebody bleeding and they're anemic, you kind of know what's going on.
Well, they could always be bleeding into the bowel or something a little bit more like a little secret bleed.
Would you go as far as to describe it as an occult bleed?
I try not to use those kinds of words because I do believe that words have a lot of power in my life, and I'd rather
describe it as a spirit cooking bleed.
So we got this guy. We don't know. Maybe bleeding. Maybe he has a Hillary Clinton bleed in his bowel. How are we? What next test should we consider to try and figure out maybe if we're thinking between a production issue and a destruction issue?
Well, I think I can answer that question directly and then discuss some other labs that are helpful. So obviously, a CBC and diff establishing an anemia, which to review is less than, what is it again for females and males? 135 for males, I believe, 120 for females. And then MCV should be between 80 and 100 for normocytic. And then in terms of distinguishing between an issue with production, and we'll talk about the various etiologies there, and destruction, it might be helpful to get a reticulocyte count. So reticulocytes are nucleated RBCs, red blood cells, and they should be appropriate or they should be within normal limits or elevated in the setting of an anemia. And if they're significantly low, that might lead you toward suspicion of a issue with production. Similarly, there are signs of intracellular hemolysis and other types of hemolysis, such as LDH, which is an intracellular enzyme in the red cell. Haptoglobin. So haptoglobin is inversely correlated with hemolysis. That is, haptoglobin is consumed with intravascular hemolysis. I think what does it do? It sort of mops up hemoglobin, I think.
Yeah, it mops up hemoglobin, takes it back to the liver.
Right. And then peripheral smear can also show signs of hemolysis or production issues for that matter, but maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit of further detail. Anything you want to add at that stage before sort of itemizing other useful labs in the setting of a normocytic anemia workup? So to distinguish between production and destruction?
From completeness sake, you could throw in a bilirubin.
Right. So bilirubin elevated in hemolysis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a heme byproduct, I believe. Heme destruction byproduct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
With the Ratix, that's a big kind of a differentiating factor between the production and the destruction issues. If the reticulocytes are low, then we know that the marrow is having difficulty in producing new red blood cells despite the anemia. Whereas an elevated reticulocyte count, and we know that production can increase like 6 to 8 times with anemia, and the elevated reticulocyte count would reflect more of a destruction issue. So a higher turnover of the red blood cells.
Interesting. Yeah, and fair point. And sorry, I don't know this sort of subtle detail, but like a normal Ratix count in the setting of a significant anemia, I think would be sort of suggestive of an issue with production. So I think I misspoke. But anyhow, I think that's a useful clarification. Okay.
I might be wrong here. I think it was like 2%. Like if it's 2% Ratix in the setting, like if it's above 2% Ratix in the setting like anemia, that's normal because it's trying to replace the cells. But if it's like lower than that in the setting of anemia, you have a production issue.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Ratic index.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's right. Yeah, and it's reticulocyte, and this is detailed, but well, perhaps not. Reticulocyte production index, which is a ratio between hematocrit, that is the percentage of serum that's composed of hemoglobin, and the maturation factor, which is the Ratic count, which is expressed as a percentage of red cells. Good. So obviously with lower hematocrits, we anticipate higher levels of reticulocytes, and I believe the multiplier, it should equal roughly 45. That is, to illustrate. With a hematocrit of 45%, the Ratic counts should be around 1%. With a hematocrit of 20, so probably a fairly severe anemia, you might anticipate the Ratic count to be like 2.5. Anyhow, that was a little bit of detail, but I think it was useful.
In terms of the production issues, let's say the Ratic index is low. What would we be thinking of in our differential here? So a production issue. So one thing that we can think about is a dysfunction in the production of the EPO, which is something we would see with chronic kidney disease. Basically, the kidneys don't produce as much EPO in order to stimulate.